Thank you. Um, Terima kasih. Thank you for the invitation. It's my pleasure to present today. I'm going to spend approximately the next 30 to 45 minutes um, covering important things about hydration. And without further ado, I would like to start my presentation with some questions. What if water was a nutrient? What if people were drinking according to the guidelines? What if most people were well hydrated? And what if water was the fluid of choice for everyone? So I'm going to start by something that everybody knows. It's a common knowledge that water is um, the our body is made out of water. Our body is made for at least 50 to 60 to 70% of water, depends on age, body composition, and other factors. But water, unfortunately, is the least studied topic in nutrition. So one exercise that I do quite often, especially when I teach my classes, I go over, these are actually screenshots of four papers that were published about 15-20 years ago in 2003 in the Journal of Nutrition. Those are great papers, actually, if you want to read in four concise papers the history of human nutrition. These four papers do that. So they cover everything from 1785 all the way to 1985 regarding what we know about nutrition and the history of nutritional science. So what I've done, and probably knowing that I do like hydration science and I'm interested in how water impacts health and performance, I opened those papers one by one. I have read them very carefully. I do like the historic aspect of science in general. So when and I search those papers, and when you have them in PDF, it's very easy to do the search. And I add the word water. And I was trying to see how many times the word water appears in those papers. So in most of them appears probably 2 to 3 times, and most of the time in random elements not related to the impact of water in health or wellness. But one thing that was particularly interesting, that suddenly in one of those papers, in the one that was actually the 1912 to 1944, the word water came up multiple times. So I got excited for a few seconds, and then I realized that it was not the word water, it was Atwater. Atwater was a scientist, an American nutrition scientist, one of the fathers of nutrition. The American Society of Nutrition has annual awards that they give to scientists for their contribution in nutrition science. So it was not the word per se of water, it was the scientist, Dr. Atwater. Anyway, so if we look carefully in the history of dietary guidelines, USDA, the American Department of Agriculture, has developed guidelines, exist for 150 years, and they have developed guidelines for many years now. And one of the first guidelines that we ever had were published in 1947, and they were called the Basic 7. So in this circle, as you can see here, they had different food groups, and the intention was to simplify it, and so that you need to consume all those different types of food to be able to have a good nutrition and cover your nutritional needs. Later on in 1956, they introduced the Basic 4, and that was an effort to simplify, and they had fruits and vegetables, dairy, meats and fish, and grains, in an effort to make the message simpler and easier for consumers to understand. Later on in 1992, they developed the pyramid, and pyramid actually is the element that is very, very widely used still around the world, and I'm familiar with the Indonesian pyramid. So every time I look in those dietary guidelines, and especially when the first pyramids came out, I was carefully looking whether there is water as part of the pyramid. And if you look carefully, there is no water anywhere. There is something that looks like a glass, but it's glass of water, and that potentially is either yogurt or cereal with milk. So in 2005, the pyramid got upgraded, and instead of being a bottom-up approach, it became more like slices, and each slice will represent different food groups. So again, if you look carefully, you see there is milk multiple times in glasses and in Tetra boxes. However, nothing about water. Later on in 2011, when My Plate came out in the United States, I got excited for a few seconds when I saw that circle, and for a second I thought it was water, till I read the word dairy, and I was trying to figure out what kind of dairy is this, which is blue. But unfortunately, even up to 2011, there was no water, at least in the consumer-friendly paradigm for guidelines regarding what people have to eat to stay healthy. So in 2015, when the dietary guidelines got published, and this is a website that has this dietary guidelines. This is a website. It's health.gov, dietary guidelines 2015. I went to this website, and I went right up here in the search box. I typed water, and I click search, and this is what I got. I got 4 things. The first one talking about what is a calorie, the definition of a calorie, 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree centigrade, etc. The second and the third one, it was referring particularly to the importance of converting sugary drinks, avoiding drinking sugary drinks and replacing them with plain water. And the fourth one, that was actually my favorite, that came out, it says hands should be washed using soap and water. So it was interesting. I started laughing for a few seconds, and it was a little bit disappointed that even the 2015 dietary guidelines had almost completely ignored the importance of water in health. And if I want to continue in this topic, I mean, we go to conferences, we publish papers, and quite often when we try to identify what section, what area we're supposed to submit our work for a conference, or what section in a journal is supposed the paper to be submitted, when the concentration of the study is about water, we have very hard time, because most journals and most conferences, they don't have any section specifically dedicated to water. So we typically put it under energy balance or macronutrient intake, etc. So I like to use the expression that water has been the forgotten nutrient, and it's something that both myself and other scientists have used that term for the last probably 10-15 years, because water has been forgotten to be studied, has been forgotten also to be presented in the dietary guidelines. So let me give you a little bit of a quick tour of what happens when we drink water. So obviously when we ingest water, water goes through the GI system, it gets absorbed by the stomach and the intestines. It appears in the plasma, and it gets distributed in the plasma, plasma is relatively small in volume. We have about 3.5 liters of plasma. And then it's transferred in the interstitial volume, so it can be transferred between plasma and interstitial volume, and then from the interstitial volume it can go to the cells. So these are an example of volumes between plasma, interstitial space, and inside the cells. And also the water can be transferred between those elements, and of course water can be released back to the environment through the kidneys via urination. And this is water from plasma that gets filtrated through the kidney, and it's excreted as urine. and also water that we lose from the interstitial space as sweat, as a response to mainly during exercise or high physical activity in a warm environment. So these three compartments, they talk, and the water can be transferred from one compartment to the other. And there are three different ways that can be transferred. One is osmosis, which is the one that we know for many years. Pressures, hydrostatic pressures, that they do have an impact on how water gets transferred. People with hypertension, for example, they develop edema because water leaks out of the plasma in the interstitial space, and we have edema, water accumulation under the skin. And more recently, during the last approximately 20 years, we have learned that there are specific water channels, also known as aquaporins, that they're available pretty much everywhere in the body. There are around 9 different aquaporins, and here in this diagram you can see they are located in different organs, and even in places that you would not consider that we have water channels, like the bones. So let me give you a little bit of an overview what happens and how water intake gets regulated. So drinking and thirst is something that most of the time we refer as a synonymous words, even though they're not. But usually we think that we drink when we're thirsty. So thirst gets stimulated by those receptors in our body that they're called osmoreceptors, and they're called osmoreceptors because they do measure osmolality or osmotic pressure. And when the osmoreceptors get activated, we get thirsty. We also have these receptors that they measure pressure, and for this reason we call them baroreceptors. Both the osmoreceptors and the baroreceptors can activate thirst, and as a response, when we get thirsty, we consume water. Those receptors also have an effect on stimulating some hormones that they regulate water balance. And probably the single most important hormone in the water body homeostasis is vasopressin, or AVP, arginine vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone, and I will explain in a little bit more about AVP. So what AVP does, one of the main action regarding fluid homeostasis, is that it does antidiuresis. So it decreases urinary output, or it increases the water reabsorption within the nephron of the kidney, resulting in producing less urine, which is less in volume and more concentrated. So by doing that, we decrease the amount of water that gets released from the body, and as a response, we conserve some water and we avoid further water losses and potentially dehydration. On the other side, the baroreceptors that we can see here on the right hand side of the screen stimulate the hormone which is called angiotensin, and actually angiotensin 2, which is a potent vasoconstrictor, so it helps in regulating blood pressure. Angiotensin also stimulates aldosterone, and aldosterone plays a significant role in decreasing natriuresis. Actually here, this is a little bit of a mistake. It doesn't increase, it decreases that natriuresis. So higher aldosterone decreases the amount of sodium excreted through the urine. So we don't urinate as much sodium as a response. So let's go back to the vasopressin story. Let me explain you a little bit about vasopressin. So vasopressin is a very small molecule. It's consisted of 8 amino acids. It's called nonapeptide. It's produced by an area in the hypothalamus from the magnocellular level, magnocellular cells, neurons, in the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular neurons. It's transferred from here down to the posterior pituitary, and from the posterior pituitary gets secreted into the circulation. So from the brain, vasopressin gets released in the circulation, and then there are actions of vasopressin in many different organs that we will talk about them later on. But the main two actions that we know about vasopressin is the blood pressure regulation. So vasopressin, it increases blood pressure, so it does vasoconstriction, and that was the original function that was known about vasopressin. And the second action that we know is the antidiuretic effect. That's why the second name of the same molecule, ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, that decreases diuresis, so it decreases the urinary output. So even though most people call it vasopressin, and I tend to refer to it as vasopressin or AVP, in physiological level, so most of the time during the day, that molecule has mostly antidiuretic effect, because in order to reach very high levels, to be able to have effect on regulation and blood pressure, it takes a massive amount of vasopressin secretion in the blood. So because during the day we don't have that very high level of vasopressin in the circulation, we don't get this effect in the blood pressure, but we very often get this effect, the antidiuretic effect, during the day, even with very small levels of vasopressin. So let me explain you a little bit why vasopressin is important and how it gets implicated in health. So vasopressin is stimulated primarily by plasma osmolality. So this is potentially the most significant contributor to vasopressin. And if you see here in this diagram, we have vasopressin versus plasma osmolality, and we can see it's pretty much a linear relationship. So as plasma osmolality increases, so if we don't drink enough water and plasma osmolality starts rising and we get progressively dehydrated, vasopressin increases. So this is straightforward. We know it gets secreted from posterior pituitary. It has an effect in the kidneys, and as a response, we have lower urinary output. So let's see what osmolality has. What is the effect of osmolality in thirst? Because we also said that thirst is stimulated by osmolality. We can also see here that there is a nice linear relationship between plasma osmolality and thirst that we can see here on the right hand side of the diagram. What is interesting though, if we superimpose those two diagrams and we see them together, one of the things that we can see is that it seems to be a delay between on the threshold of osmolality that leads to increase in vasopressin versus increase in thirst. So it seems that vasopressin threshold is around 285, 286 maybe, versus on the other side, increase on thirst doesn't happen until we have plasma osmolality above 291, 292 and higher. So it seems to be a delay in the threshold of stimulating this hormone. So I'm not trying to say that thirst is not important, and I'm not trying to say that thirst is not powerful signal. Thirst actually, according to Gary Robinson, is one of the most powerful behavior drives, and specifically says that when it is maximally stimulated in humans, the craving for water cannot be ignored and can become sufficient intense to dominate all other thoughts and sensations. So what I'm trying to say is the fact that we're not getting thirsty very easily and there is that delay in osmotic stimulation of thirst, it might be a good thing, because if we were getting thirsty immediately with a very small water deficit, we would probably concentrate on finding water, because thirst is a very dominant sensation. And I like to use the term, this is actually a title of a paper that I wrote a few years ago, that thirst seems to be a survival instinct versus a sensitive fluid balance homeostatic mechanism. So even though we say thirst is only responsible for drinking, in reality, drinking is a response of many other things. So drinking is not only what in science we say homeostatic mechanism. It's not only plasma osmolality and baroreceptor stimulation. Plasma is also drinking is also what we call anticipatory event. So when we eat, for example, expecting that we will need water because we ate food that contains osmoles, proteins, and salts, or have high osmolality and sugars. So we become thirsty and we want to drink because we anticipate the need for water. Also, drinking is a palatability issue. So if I give you something that doesn't taste well, if the water that I give you is very warm, for example, in a hot day, or if it has a strange flavor, obviously it would not be very palatable and you're not going to be drinking enough. And of course, water and drinking, it's always a matter of availability. We can talk all day about the importance of water and thirst and everything, but if there is no water, we cannot have drinking. And lastly, and very important, it's something that we forget, drinking is a behavior. There are people that they have learned to drink a lot of water. And it seems to be also a genetic component to that. There are people that they are genetically predisposed to consume large amount of water. So if we go back to the same diagram and we look at the osmotic stimulation between thirst and vasopressin, and if we go back to this difference in this threshold, and we try to quantify this zone between increase in vasopressin but before the onset of thirst, we can see that there is a zone here that arginine vasopressin gets stimulated in the blood. So we can see relatively high levels of vasopressin in the circulation. However, we're not even thirsty yet. We have not felt thirst perception, and potentially we're not even seeking water consumption. So let me show you how relevant and how important is that in daily life. These are some data that were published a few years ago by Erica Perrier and her colleagues. And this is what they did. They took 250 subjects, and from those they identify only the 100 subjects that they were either high drinkers or low drinkers. So the ones that they like to consume a lot of water or very little water. So they took the two pretty much extreme cases, the high levels and the low levels. So what they identify, that the only two things that they could find significantly different between those two groups, the high drinkers and the low drinkers, was high AVP in the low drinkers and high cortisol. Both of those issues are very important. And unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about what is the effect on high cortisol level, but I will spend some time today actually talking about what is the effect on high vasopressin. So let's see what happened with children a little bit. And these are some data that were collected a few years ago from Jody Stuckey and her colleagues. They measured about 600 kids, and they found that their urine osmolality, and this is a frequency diagram, so the height of these bars indicate how many kids there are in different urine osmolality levels. This data indicated that majority of kids, and you can see bulk of the frequencies in this diagram, indicate that their urine concentration was very high, was from 500-600 milliosmol and higher, indicating that these kids had very, very concentrated urine and they were not consuming adequate amount of water. More recently, Erica Kenny from Harvard University published some data from the ENHANCE study, and these are the findings actually that I would like to summarize in this diagram. So number one, more than 50% of children are what is called underhydrated based on very concentrated urine. 1 in 4 children do not consume any water throughout the day, 0 water consumption. And more than 3 out of 4 children consume more than 1 sugary drink per day. Sugar sweetened beverage is the SSB. So this is the picture in America. And the beauty of this study is that the data are collected as part of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, weighted per population, so they're a really representative sample for kids all the way up to 18 years old in America. So the data in older adults are even more worrisome, I would say. And with older adults, we know very well what is happening. Majority of older adults are underhydrated. Their ability to drink, or their ability to get thirsty is significantly diminished. And even when they get thirsty, they're not drinking enough. And when they drink, they end up urinating more and eliminating a greater amount of their urine, of their water intake through urination. So older adults are definitely in a higher risk than younger individuals. So let me show you some data as far as what does it mean not to consume appropriate amount of water. And these are some data that we published a few years ago. Actually, about 3 years ago, 2017, European Journal of Nutrition, we were looking at the impact of hypohydration on the cardiovascular system, and we measure specifically what is called endothelial function through flow-mediated dilation, or FMD. So what we found is that when we test the same people in euhydrated condition and in hypohydrated condition, their flow-mediated dilation decreased by approximately 20% as a response to hypohydration. So we suggested that hypohydration seems to be an important factor that we have to pay attention to it when we talk about cardiovascular health. Also in 2017, we published another study looking at the impact of water intake in patients with diabetes, and we were looking specific at their ability to regulate blood sugar. So we examined patients with diabetes. We cut them off the medication for 3 days, and we make them undergo either high water intake or low water intake regime for 3 days. And we brought them in the lab and we gave them 75 grams of glucose, trying to get the glycemic response. And we found that when they were hypohydrated, which is the dark data, their blood glucose was significantly higher, versus when they were euhydrated, their blood glucose was significantly lower. What is interesting, we found that plasma cortisol was significantly lower during the euhydrated experiment when compared to the hypohydrated experiment. Last year we published another study trying to examine in a more controlled fashion dehydration by inducing dehydration in the laboratory, and we induced what is called osmotically stimulated dehydration. So we took 60 males and females from 30 to 55 years old. We brought them in the lab and we did for 2 hours, we did either hypertonic saline infusion or isotonic saline infusion. So with the hypertonic saline infusion, what we try to do, we try to increase osmolality, and as a response increase vasopressin, and trying to examine the impact of vasopressin on glucose regulation. So at the 0 time point, we gave them 75 grams of glucose, or what we know as a oral glucose tolerance test. And this is their glycemic responses during the 4 following hours. So blood glucose increased to a greater extent, even though they consume exactly, the same people consume exactly the same amount of water in the 2 trials. And blood insulin was significantly lower at the first 30 and 60 minutes during the dehydrated trial. So we concluded that vasopressin, even if we do osmotic stimulation of vasopressin, seems to acutely impair our ability to regulate blood glucose. So outside of the blood glucose and diabetes regulation, etc., there are a lot of other impact that water intake has on health. And a classic one is the urinary tract infection. And I know for years many people have suggested that consuming more water might be a good way to improve, to prevent recurrence of urinary tract infection. However, not a single study had shown that until about a year ago, when this group published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the JAMA, which is one of the highest impact factor medical journal, this study. So in this study, they recruited 160 women with history of urinary tract infection. They randomly assigned them in two different groups, a group that will go increase in water intake versus the group that underwent the regular practice, so what is the control group. And the data were really fascinating. So this is the intervention group and this is the control group. The number of urinary tract infections, 111 versus 216, minus 105. Number of antimicrobial regimens, so how many times they prescribed to these two groups antibiotics. 1.9 times in the group of higher water intake versus 3.6 times in the control group. Days interval between urinary tract infection, 143 days in the high water intake group versus 84. So we can clearly see the impact of water intake, the increase in water intake in the urinary tract infection, as far as having a recurrent episode in urinary tract infection in populations that they are prone to develop UTIs. Last year we had also a very interesting study that was published from a group of scientists of the National Institute of Health from the United States, and a couple things actually that I wanted to show you and emphasize. It's particularly in this table down here, where they predicted the decrease of disease prevalence in a lifespan, and they were looking particularly during aging. For ages of 70 to 85 years old, the predicted decrease of the disease prevalence, number one was dementia, decreased by 48%, heart failure 24%, chronic lung disease 20%, chronic kidney disease 10%, diabetes 11%. So overall, they talk about 3 million people could have health improvement just by increasing water intake. And also in experimental animals, in mice, they found that longevity itself seems to be associated with water intake. So they did a series of experiments with water restriction, and they found that experimental animals that they restricted the water intake, they live less and they develop a lot of chronic disease. Also last year, an Italian group looked at the prevalence of hypohydration and its association in patients with stroke. And the take-home message was the symptoms during discharge from the hospital was significantly lower in the group that they appear in the hospital, that they were euhydrated, versus to the ones that they had poor fluid intake symptoms. So the patients were way much better and they had much better outcome coming out of the hospital if they will show up euhydrated versus if they will show up in a poor hydration state. So of course there are a lot of data, and we don't really have the time to go into a great detail and cover all potential impacts of water intake and longevity, wellness, and health. Just to show you an area that I'm particularly interested, which is the hyperglycemia or diabetes and glucose dysregulation that we already talked about it. These are a series of papers from a French group right on the top, from a British group lower, Swedish group, two different Swedish studies, a study from France in experimental animals, and the study that I spoke to you earlier from our group, all of them indicating that low water intake is a risk for developing hyperglycemia and diabetes. Also, low water intake is associated with kidney disease and cardiovascular disease, and we have multiple studies indicating that urinary specific gravity or very concentrated urine is a predictor for neurological deterioration and acute ischemic stroke. Several studies linking dehydration with mood, particularly in women. There are studies showing that angiotensin, and if you inhibit angiotensin, and there is a simple way that you can inhibit or prevent increasing angiotensin by drinking more water, you can impact longevity. Data on angiotensin 2 blockade and aging process. So there are a lot of things that over the years, and especially over the last probably 5 to 10 years, that we have learned. So what is interesting, and I would like to go back to where we started the presentation, is the paradigm of not being thirsty. So living in that zone that you're not really thirsty, but your body knows that you're not drinking adequate amount of water, and you have elevated vasopressin. So what is the response and how we can see that? We can see that because we're not going to the bathroom often, and when we go to the bathroom, the urine looks dark, yellow like this, or sometimes even darker, like more like orange. So this stimulation of vasopressin seems to have a lot of negative effects on health. And even though I said today that vasopressin has two things, the vasoactive effect, so blood pressure regulation, plus the antidiuretic effect, the decrease in urinary output, it seems that AVP or vasopressin has a lot of other impacts in many different areas, from metabolic syndrome to chronic kidney disease to hypertension, cognition, infections, bone health, pain, even social behavior, and aging and inflammation seems to be impacted by vasopressin. So let me go back to the story of diabetes and vasopressin. And here, instead of measuring vasopressin, they were measuring copeptin, which is a surrogate marker that is 1-to-1 ratio to vasopressin. It's just more stable and it's easier to measure. So if you look here, the levels of copeptin and vasopressin above 6.1 and 10.7 lead to a 3 to 4 times increased risk for diabetes. So look at these values of vasopressin right here. When you're not thirsty, but you do have stimulated vasopressin level, somewhere between 3 to maybe 11 to 12. So right close to that range. So it seems to be that zone of having vasopressin but not being thirsty seems to be a risk for development of diabetes, at least based on this epidemiological data from Sweden. So I've heard stories from people saying, yes, this is okay, and not being thirsty, you're okay. Your body knows that you don't need so much water. And your body can regulate that because you don't pee much, so you don't waste much water, and you can recover. I personally disagree. I don't think it's okay. Or maybe having high vasopressin and not having thirst, it's probably as okay as smoking during pregnancy. And smoking during pregnancy was okay some years ago. And these are advertisements back in the 50s where this is what it says here: win-win-win. Easy labor, slim baby, full flavor of Winston. Or bore gently. And what it refers to, actually, it refers that smoking leads to less of an growth of the embryo, and as a response, when women were giving birth that they were smoking during pregnancy, they will deliver smaller babies. So if you have smaller babies, you have easier delivery. So it's a win situation. Smoke during pregnancy, and if you pay attention, this lady right here not only smoking, but she's also drinking alcohol during pregnancy. So obviously this is not a good thing, and I like to compare the having chronically elevated vasopressin is not a good thing. And it seems to come to a high cost. And I think we spoke a little bit about the high cost of vasopressin. And I think there are much more to learn over the years regarding the impact of high vasopressin and the impact of not drinking enough water on health. So I would like to make a recommendation, and even though for years I've been traveling around the world and talking about hydration and calling water the forgotten nutrient, I would like to stop calling it the forgotten nutrient, and I would suggest to start calling it water the emerging nutrient. So water is the next nutrient, and it's the next super nutrient, the one that can really help us to improve health. And actually water is something that we can easily include in our daily routines, in our daily diet. And I would like to close in a similar fashion of how we started. I would like to close with a question again. What if drinking water is a simple and economic way to improve health? Thank you.